Hello, everyone. This is Randy here, and we are back for part two of our analysis of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. In Mandarin, it is known as Sun Tzu Bingfa. We always have to pronounce it in its native language. So in my last episode, we analyzed the art of war from the perspective of a trial lawyer. So we drew some parallels between the art of war and the art of litigation. In today's episode, we are going to concentrate on one very famous paragraph from the art of war, where Sun Tzu says, "Know your enemy and know yourself. And if you do, you will be guaranteed victory in 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not your enemy, for every victory, there shall be a defeat." And Sun Tzu finishes by saying, if you know neither yourself nor your enemy, then you shall always be defeated. So this is a very famous phrase, which is often just simplified as being know thy enemy and know thyself. So it comes from Sun Tzu's Art of War. Today I'm going to give three non-military examples of knowing your enemy, knowing yourself, perhaps not knowing yourself and knowing your enemy, and then a case of knowing yourself but not knowing your enemy. So we'll go through a couple of examples, historic examples. And I'm really excited to share these examples with you. We're going to talk about a famous boxing match. We're going to talk about a famous chess match. And then we're going to finish it off with an example from a famous duel. So get ready, relax, sit back, and we have some very exciting historic examples for you about this particular principle. Know thy enemy and know thyself. So I'm first going to start with an example of where the victor in this particular example I'm about to give you definitely knew his enemy and he knew himself, and that's why he won. So I'm going to take you back to 1974. And we're going to go to the city of Kinshasa in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's in the center of Africa. The feeling in the air is electric, and there's excitement, and you can feel it because one of the greatest sports tournaments or sports events is about to take place, and it's called Rumble in the Jungle. It's this great boxing match between no other than Muhammad Ali and his rival at the time, George Foreman. So this story is going to be from the perspective of Muhammad Ali and how he knew his enemy and knew himself. So Muhammad Ali at this time was a little bit past his prime. So this was not the height of his physical prime. And the challenger, George Foreman, was bigger, was stronger, and had been undefeated at the time. He was just a monster. He was strong. He punched with such ferocity, and he was just pummeling his opponents. So the people who were making the bets for the fight actually had placed Muhammad Ali as the underdog in this particular fight. Even though Muhammad Ali had, a very storied resume, if you will, a very elaborate resume of wins, but he was getting close to the end of his prime here, and most bettors, if you will, they were or odds makers, they were placing him as the underdog. Now, Muhammad Ali knew that he couldn't fight his enemy just blow for blow. It would certainly result in a defeat for him. The younger and stronger George Foreman would simply outpunch him. So Muhammad Ali had to use his intelligence. So, Muhammad and his team reviewed the fights that George Foreman had in prior to this bout, and they were trying to find weaknesses. Like, what is it about George Foreman that we could perhaps exploit? He had very, very few weaknesses, but they did notice one thing: that after a while, he got tired. Right? He didn't have the best stamina. He had great strength. Right? He could punch a hole through your body, but he didn't have the best stamina. So Muhammad Ali realized this in understanding his enemy. And he also understood himself in terms of what he was good at, in terms of the strategy that he wanted to employ. So the fight happens, and in the first round, the fighters go into the boxing ring, and Muhammad Ali tries to trade blows with George Foreman, almost as an experiment. If I were just to fight you by trading blows, what would happen? Didn't go very well for Muhammad Ali. He immediately realized that his assessment was correct. George Foreman was a stronger, younger, and just a more ferocious fighter. So in the second round, Muhammad Ali tried something very different. And this actually surprised a lot of people, became very famous what he did strategically. He decides to slow down the pace. He decides to do something called rope-a-dope. So he goes against the ropes in the boxing ring, and he puts his hands up like this and just allows George Foreman to punch him. And in fact, he encourages George Foreman to punch him. He taunts George Foreman. And George Foreman just wails at him. He punches. And Muhammad Ali, having his hands up, just deflects most of these shots, right? They're not hitting his head. They're hitting his arm, so they're being deflected. So very little damage is being taken. But George is a strong man. He keeps punching and punching. Round 2, round 3, round 4, round 5, round 6, round 7. There's 6 rounds of Muhammad Ali just putting his weight against the ropes and allowing George Foreman to punch him. And then in the 8th round, George Foreman is visibly tired. In fact, at the end of the fight, when he did his post-fight interview, I'm not sure if it was exactly at the very end of the fight or several months later, but in an interview he did, George Foreman said this was the most tired I'd ever been, right? He was barely able to stand up. That's how tired he was. His cardio was working overtime. And that's when Muhammad Ali changes the pace. He takes the initiative. He starts to counter punch at George Foreman and eventually knocks him out in the 8th round. So I would say that's a really brilliant example of knowing your enemy, knowing your enemy's weaknesses, and then knowing yourself, knowing your strength. And Muhammad Ali played George Foreman beautifully. Even though he was the underdog, he won not with greater strength, but with greater intelligence. So that's the first example of knowing your enemy and knowing yourself. I'm going to give you another example, and this is with respect to a very famous chess match. And this is an example of not quite knowing yourself, at least not at the beginning, and perhaps knowing your enemy, but not quite knowing yourself. And you can see why in this particular example, not knowing yourself actually begins to create problems for our protagonist here in the next example. So our protagonist in the next example is no other than Bobby Fischer. The backdrop is as follows. It's 1972 at the height of the Cold War, right? This is just, a couple years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a lot of tension geopolitically between the United States and the Soviet Union. And both from a political and a military standpoint, and also in the realm of sports and games, these two geopolitical titans are vying for power. And in 1972, in Reykjavik, Iceland, there is a chess match between this young chess prodigy, Bobby Fischer, and the Soviet champion, Boris Spassky. And at the time, Boris Spassky had never been defeated by Bobby Fischer. As well, the Soviets had dominated international chess for decades at this particular point. So the Americans rely on this young, energetic prodigy, Bobby Fischer. But the problem is, Bobby didn't quite know himself that well going into the match, at least psychologically. The first match, Bobby plays Boris Spassky, and he's immediately annoyed by the crowd, because this match was taking place publicly, and by the cameras. Psychologically, it had quite an effect on him. It had a detrimental effect on him. He was annoyed. He was paranoid, perhaps, and certainly the environment was not conducive to him playing his ideal game. If Bobby Fischer perhaps knew himself a bit more, he would have taken this into account in terms of his preparation, his mental preparation, in terms of choosing the setting by which the chess match was to take place. And it was a game of up to 24 matches. The first person to win 12 and a half. So you get half a point for a draw and a full point for a win. So for first to 12 and a half wins this tournament of 24 matches. So Bobby is visibly distracted and irritated by the media attention, by the crowd, and especially by the cameras. In the first game, he makes what would be considered quite an amateurish mistake for a grandmaster level person like Bobby Fischer. He ends up trapping his own bishop behind enemy lines, and eventually needs to sacrifice it. Then he resigns. So a fairly amateurish and a fairly strange move for someone of Bobby Fischer's level. It appears perhaps that the environment and the cameras it got to him psychologically. He complained. In fact, he complained about the cameras. He complained about the noises the cameras were making. In the second game, Bobby Fischer doesn't show up at all. He completely misses the second game. He refuses to play Boris Spassky. So Boris Spassky just waits there, and Bobby Fischer, as just pouts or whatever he's doing, he just or maybe he's scared, maybe he's angry. We don't know what he was thinking at the time, but he just refuses to show up. And the story goes that he was ready to leave the tournament. He was on the tarmac at the airport in Reykjavik, ready to go home. He was ready just to quit, right? Something about the tournament setting had triggered him. He was psychologically at a breaking point where he said, like, I'm not going to do this tournament. And the story goes that the American team convinced him to stay, and that there was a phone call from the famous politician Henry Kissinger, that because again he was representing America, right? He was representing one side of the Cold War. That at the very top, Henry Kissinger gives Bobby Fischer a call, and as the story goes, and convinces him to stay at the tournament and keep playing. So Bobby Fischer then renegotiates the environment by which the two are playing. In the third match, they play in the back room away from the cameras, and suddenly something clicks. There is a fire in Bobby Fischer's eyes, and suddenly he's pulling out moves that Boris Spassky's never seen before. He's being creative. He's making moves on the chessboard that he's never made before, at least not against Boris Spassky. And this takes Boris Spassky by surprise, and he takes the initiative, and eventually wins round 3. And a lot of people say that that's when the initiative changed. That's when the dynamic of this particular chess match changed. Was game 3, right? Game 1 and 2, first game he loses. Second game he doesn't even show up. He's down 2-0, right? But then the dynamics change in game 3, And now Bobby Fischer. Whatever happened between game 2 and 3, maybe it was that magic phone call from Henry Kissinger, maybe it was something else, maybe he found his zen, he grounded himself. Whatever happened, he understood himself more, and he suddenly found his own peace, and then he started to understand his enemy, which was Boris Spassky, and then he had won against Boris Spassky for the first time ever in game 3 of that tournament. Right, he had cracked the code, and then the momentum was in his favor. The winds against his sails. Now the momentum was in his favor, pushing him towards an eventual victory of the tournament. Game 4 was a tie. Game 6 he won in such an outstanding fashion that the crowd actually gave him an applause, and Boris Spassky even stood up and also applauded Bobby Fischer in game 6. That's known as the applause game. And in fact, this applause by the Soviet player is the inspiration for a scene in Queen's Gambit, where the fictional American female grandmaster chess player is applauded by the Soviet player at the very end of this Netflix series. And Queen's Gambit is also a book, but this applause scene, it's actually inspired by Game 6 of the 1972 Reykjavik tournament. Bobby Fischer eventually wins 12.5 to 8.5, wins against Boris Spassky. But it was really close, right? In the beginning, he didn't quite know himself. The environment was triggering him. He was getting paranoid about the cameras. But eventually he found himself, and then he defeated his enemy. I'll give you one last example. Where in this scenario, we'll call him our protagonist. Our protagonist in this particular scenario knew himself, but did not know his enemy. At least not very well, and it actually cost him his life. This is a famous duel that happened in 1804 between no other than Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Two very famous American politicians, both lawyers, and the backdrop and some of the background behind this duel is that Alexander Hamilton had been stifling Aaron Burr's career for some time now. So the two of them did not get along personally or professionally, and Alexander Hamilton made it clear that he was against Aaron Burr's ambitions, his political ambitions, and his political vision, and did his very best to stifle him in the course of his career, so that he wouldn't, for example, become president, and he wouldn't become, he wouldn't ascend to certain positions. So this certainly ticked off Aaron Burr to a large extent, and the two of them traded some letters. Aaron Burr requested that Alexander Hamilton apologize, which Alexander Hamilton refused to do. So Aaron Burr did the most logical thing that a gentleman could do in the early 1800s, which is to offer and challenge Alexander Hamilton to a duel. So Alexander Hamilton, being a man of honor, and dueling was part of the prevailing culture at the time, although it was illegal in the United States, it was accepted. Very few people were actually prosecuted, or at least not prosecuted successfully, for dueling. It was just this practice that existed outside of the law in practice, but in theory was illegal, and that if you killed someone in a duel, it was considered murder. But very few people, if any, were actually charged at the time for murder, because it was considered an honorable thing. So very, very strange parallel legal system or legal custom. But that was the situation with respect to dueling. It was considered an honorable thing if you had insulted a gentleman's woman, or insulted his honor, or defamed him. That was the best way to settle a score, is to shoot pistols at each other. So that's what they did. So Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, they arrive on their chosen field in the morning in this particular day in 1804 to engage in this duel. Now, Alexander Hamilton assumed that this duel was just for show, all right, to an extent, that it was a demonstration of bravery, it was a demonstration of one's principles, and it was a common practice for both men to take their pistols and shoot above the other man's head. As an indication, I came to the duel, I was ready to die for my honor, but I'm not actually here to kill you, right? That there was sort of a gentleman's understanding, at least between a lot of people, that would be the case. Now, Alexander Hamilton certainly understood himself and what he wanted to do. He did not quite understand his enemy and his enemy's intentions. So in this case, at the start of the duel, Alexander Hamilton takes his pistol, he shoots above Aaron Burr's head, right? Demonstrating honor and demonstrating bravery and demonstrating, look, I showed up for the duel, I'm ready to die, but I'm not actually here to kill you, right? It's an honorable thing to do. Aaron Burr had no such intentions. Aaron Burr took his gun and he shoots at Alexander Hamilton, shoots him in the abdomen, and within a day, Alexander Hamilton is dead, right? He's mortally wounded by this shot, falls to the ground. Aaron Burr was here to kill. Right? He wasn't here to demonstrate honor or bravery. He was here to kill. Yeah, he kills Alexander Hamilton. Within a day, Alexander Hamilton dies from massive internal bleeding and the destruction of his organs. Aaron Burr's career obviously doesn't recover from this because he's prosecuted for being a murderer. Obviously, as I said earlier, no one was thrown in jail, or very few people were thrown in jail for dueling at the time, and he escaped jail time. But his career never really recovered. He finished his stint as vice president, I believe, under the Jefferson administration, but he never really recovered, and his ambitions were not fulfilled because he was labeled as a murderer in the eyes of many. And poor Alexander Hamilton, I mean, that situation was a bit worse for him. I personally think that's a very poignant historic example of knowing yourself, but not really knowing your enemy. If Alexander Hamilton knew that Aaron Burr was here to kill, not just to demonstrate some abstract concept of honor, he probably would not have either agreed to the duel, or maybe he would have tried to kill Aaron Burr. Obviously, he didn't read his opponent correctly in that particular scenario. So those are our three stories: a boxing match, a chess game, and a duel, demonstrating to various degrees Sun Tzu's principle of knowing your enemy and knowing yourself, knowing your enemy but not exactly knowing yourself, and therefore generating defeats, and in some cases knowing yourself but not knowing your enemy, and having that be very, very fatal. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Again, this is episode 2 of a series on the analysis of Sun Tzu. We're going to go through different historic examples, contemporary examples, examples from my professional life as a lawyer, in applying and analyzing some of the principles espoused by Sun Tzu's Art of War. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, my name is Randy I hope you are having a wonderful day, and we will see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.